First of all, I'd like to thank Wolfgang for his many kind remarks about the Heartland Institute and about me in the introductory segment and also just now. I feel that he is more kind than we are deserving. But if there's one area in which I will gladly, openly accept his praise without humility, it's when Wolfgang talks about the work that we've put in at the Heartland Institute regarding our international conferences on climate change. Not so much for the content of the conferences, because that is due to the scientists, to the experts who are there speaking every year. But I'll accept the praise for the logistics, the hard work behind the scenes that goes into putting it together. And the reason I mention it now is because I can tell you from firsthand experience that for weeks leading up to this event, life has been nothing but stress for Wolfgang and the EIKE to make sure every little detail runs without a hitch. And there are going to be little details that don't run without a hitch. There are going to be little problems that pop up, whether it's worrying about people catching a flight, missing a flight, hotel reservations get messed up, things like that. And Wolfgang and EIKE have handled this not only professionally in a manner that is so impressive, but in a manner that is so completely welcoming. The hospitality that Wolfgang has shown me personally, and I see throughout the event, is just spectacular. So thank you so much, Wolfgang, but really the praise goes to you. And I can say for the Heartland Institute, although we have co-sponsored this event, all the behind-the-scenes legwork, all the logistical work has been performed by EIKE. And so if you see Wolfgang, if you see other people with EIKE tonight, over the weekend, during the next year, buy them a beer, buy them lots of beers. They're well-deserving. Now, Wolfgang's introductory remarks remind me of the first time that we put together the International Conference on Climate Change for the Heartland Institute. And I wasn't sure what kind of response we would get from the scientists themselves. And the first thing I wanted to do, to make sure that we were making it clear that we wanted open discussion, we wanted open debate. We didn't want to turn this into a one-sided conference where only one side of views were welcome, is that I initially invited 24 scientists who disagreed with us very pointedly on the science, on our position of the science. And not a single one accepted. And that seemed to confirm my fears beforehand, because I thought, who are we to put this on? Yes, we do a good amount of work trying to bring public attention to the science. I try my best to let people know in academia, in the media, the public in general, what's going on in terms of the scientific debate. But still, who am I to be bringing all these tremendously accomplished scientists together? And I feared no one would accept. But the thing is, when I started inviting folks who would be labeled climate skeptics, I had to beat them off with a stick. There was no way I could keep these scientists away, whereas the alarmists would not show up. On the other hand, once I started inviting people who are skeptical of the asserted global warming crisis, the response rate, the acceptance rate, was well over 90%. And then I went back to the alarmists and I said, look, this really is coming together well. And we're going to have some fantastic discussion. And you talk about the need for the public to understand the real issues. And we're going to have press there. Come on, and we'll treat you with respect. And still, not a single one would show up. And that just goes to show who is confident in the science, who is confident in a public debate, and who is not. And that's why I greatly appreciate the scientists that are here today, the people who are here just to observe the science, the people who will be watching video of this. Because one side of this issue talks about how the public is so ill-informed, and they bemoan the fact that people don't listen to them, or so they say. And yet, at an event like this, we can't get them to show up. Now, Wolfgang mentioned Al Gore, one of my favorite characters in this debate, and he mentioned a $50,000 offer for Al Gore to come speak at our conference. Well, Al Gore wouldn't come speak for $50,000. Eventually, as conference after conference came by, and we kept getting these reasons why he wouldn't show up, we eventually said, name your price. Name it. Whatever you want. You talk about the need to have funding for these programs, for your nonprofits that you're running. Name your price. We'll pay it. Still nothing. We offered him $100,000. If he would merely debate, he could choose a time and a place, because the excuses were often, well, we have a schedule conflict, he's busy today. So at your convenience, and we'll give you a choice of all sorts of people, you can choose one that you want to debate. We'll pay you $100,000 just for one evening. And this will give you the platform that you say you need to reach the American public. And again, Al Gore refused to participate. And again, it just goes to show who has confidence in the science and who doesn't. Now, one of the things that's important if we're going to have this discussion and debate is that we be respectful of each other's positions. I have debated this topic many times against many people, and the debate itself can be very vigorous. And it's supposed to be vigorous because we're trying to discover scientific truth. And if we're not vigorously questioning our own assumptions, questioning the data that we are presenting, and also questioning each other's, we're not going to find truth. There is a place, and indeed there is a necessity, for there to be vigorous debate, vigorous discussion in the scientific realm. But that should never be an excuse for us attacking each other personally, for attacking each other's motives, unless we have some clear reason that somebody is acting without the best of motives. We can have this discussion and debate without that personal animosity. I can tell you from personal experience, I have very vigorous discussions and debates with my wife and children, but that doesn't poison our relationship, or I certainly hope it doesn't. We can and should have this same type of outlook when we're debating the science. Now, that being the case, I'd like to discuss a few particulars regarding fact versus fiction, regarding the various sides in this debate. And oftentimes, I myself fall into the trap of saying one side or the other. There are more than two sides to the global warming debate. There are many different approaches, nuances of the various positions, and we have to avoid falling into the trap of trying to shoehorn someone into, fit someone into a particular side. What we need to do is examine the science, examine the arguments, examine them with an open mind of our own positions as well as those of our quote-unquote opponents. And you'll find that there are many different points of view on this topic. But the first one I'd like to discuss that really stands out as something that we're told about by the media, and I use the term global warming alarmists. I don't try to use it in a pejorative manner. It's just oftentimes the issue is described as whether you believe in global warming or you don't. Well, we know the Earth has warmed over the past 100, 150 years. We're no longer in the Little Ice Age. So global warming versus non-global warming really doesn't work. The assertion is, are we facing a global warming crisis? That's the real issue that we're disputing. Because if the Earth is warming in a manner, human-caused or not, that is not alarming, that is not a crisis, well then where is the need for all the programs, all the expensive programs, all the infringements on human liberty that are being prescribed to address global warming? So I use the term alarmist, and I often invite people on the other side of the issue to, if they have a better term, let me know. And that's because I personally really dislike the term denier, denialist, et cetera, that people often use to use as a barb against people who are skeptical of the assertion that we're facing a global warming crisis. But anyway, among the arguments used often, presented often by the media, by the alarmists, is that there is this overwhelming consensus among scientists that global warming is a crisis. And that if anybody disagrees with that, you might as well be disagreeing with the fact that the Earth is round, because the consensus is similar. The consensus is so overwhelming. What's real interesting is many of us in this room know, there's an entity, it's called the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine. They have what's known as the Oregon Petition, where more than 31,000 scientists have on their own found the statement, a 12-page summary of the science, indicating we're not facing a global warming crisis. They have read it. They've decided to sign it, put their own name and reputation on the line. More than 31,000 scientists have signed this document saying global warming is not a crisis. There is no counter statement, no counter argument that have 31,000 scientists signing on that we are facing a global warming crisis. And even if there were, there'd have to be a heck of a lot more than 31,000 to satisfy what the media says is this overwhelming consensus regarding global warming being a crisis. Now, the IPCC is often invoked as this so-called consensus, but it's important to note that of the 2,400 members who participated in IPCC for their last report, keep in mind that's less than 10% of the scientists who signed the Oregon Petition. Also, not all IPCC participants are scientists, so it's not 2,400 scientists, it's 2,400 participants. And even among the 2,400 people who are participants, and even if we narrow it down to scientists, many of those scientists are not experts in a field directly related to climate science. Now, of course, beyond that, we also have to keep in mind that literally thousands of statements were presented by IPCC participants contesting the conclusions that were presented by the IPCC lead authors. In other words, the IPCC participants themselves brought up thousands of disputes and disagreements with the final paper that was presented by IPCC. And what this shows is that IPCC is not the unified opinion of 2,400 people. It is what the lead authors put together after 2,400 people talk about, discuss, debate the issue, and often don't find agreement. Now, who are these lead authors? The lead authors are a relative handful of people, and they're not necessarily people who are objective or highly qualified in the issues of climate science. For example, for the last IPCC report, you had as lead authors, the folks that had final say in the document, you had staffers for environmental defense and Greenpeace. This is not a group that's giving you an objective recitation of the science. So when people talk about IPCC as being the unified opinion, the consensus opinion of the world scientists, understand this is not the case. Now, secondly, we often hear consensus is supposed to be supported by this 97% figure. This number probably rings very familiar to many of us. We're often told that 97% of the world scientists agree in this global warming crisis. Or we'll hear 97% of the world scientists agree with IPCC. Or anytime I present an argument that we're not facing a global warming crisis, I'm told, well, 97% of the world scientists disagree with you. The problem with that is, there are two so-called surveys that are used to justify the 97% assertion. In each of them, you had surveys that in and of their own methods, procedures were very flawed. And I won't get into the details, but feel free to bring it up afterwards. But even if we accept the procedures up front at face value, the two questions at the core of this survey for which we had the 97% agreement were, number one, has the globe warmed during the past century? I don't think there's anybody in this room who disagrees with that statement. We are not in the Little Ice Age anymore. Number two, have humans had some influence on that increase in temperature? Well, there are some folks who believe that humans have had no influence on temperature, but I would say most skeptics say that humans have had some influence. It may not be the driving force. Even if it is, we can talk about just how much warming is occurring and whether that is indeed something that is worthy of considering a crisis. We can talk about human influence from land use changes, from other factors, as well as greenhouse gases. So the fact that 97% of participants would answer yes to those two questions is not surprising. I answer yes to those two questions. Whenever we hear the assertion that 97% of the scientists in the world disagree with us, remember that that is a false assertion about what the 97% is. And that's why I say it's so important for us to be honest with ourselves and with each other about what we're debating. In order to have an honest, professional, cordial debate, but also one that gets at the truth, we have to be honest about what we're debating and what each other's positions are. The third argument that's often made regarding consensus is that every single science organization in the world disagrees with you. Every single one has come out and stated the opposite. First of all, that's not true. I mean, there are many scientific organizations that have not addressed the issue. There are also some that have addressed the issue and have raised grave concern about the IPCC's findings. But even if we were to say, for the sake of argument, that those organizations did not exist, and that other organizations that haven't said anything implicitly have said something, still, just what have we been told from these organizations, these scientific organizations, that we're told are on the other side of the issue? Well, let me give you an example of what is really going on behind the scenes. The American Meteorological Society, they have a group statement that the bureaucracy for the AMS, the American Meteorological Society, has put out. And it's a very alarmist statement. They have come out and said that humans are causing this amount of warming. It's happening so fast. These are the consequences that are going to occur. We're facing a crisis. But what's interesting is there have been surveys, two surveys that I'm aware of AMS scientists themselves. And in both of those surveys, the majority of scientists disagreed with what the bureaucracy had stated in their assertion that we're facing a global warming crisis. And that's why when we hear about the various science organizations that say we're facing a global warming crisis, ask yourselves, ask the people who are presenting these surveys, is this something that the bureaucracy has put forward as a statement, or is this a survey of the scientists themselves? And the only survey of the scientists themselves that I am aware of is the AMS, where there have been two surveys, and they both show that the member scientists disagree with what their bureaucratic hierarchy says is the problem. Now, another good example is the National Academy of Sciences. This, in the United States, is supposed to be our most prestigious scientific organization. This is where the most learned scientists are. So the NAS, which is the acronym for the National Academy of Sciences, they put out a statement a little over a year ago, much like the AMS statement, talking about how humans are driving the climate, how the rate of temperature increase is unprecedented. We're facing tremendous negative consequences. We must act now. Now, of course, there was no survey of NAS scientists to come about this conclusion. So who participated in this statement? There were 24 people that were invited by the NAS bureaucracy to produce this statement. Of the 24, only 5 were scientists in a field with any relationship to climate science. In fact, there were as many politicians and environmental activist group staffers on that panel as there were scientists in a climate-related field. Of those scientists, climate-related science and all other science fields, take them all together, of those scientists, every single one either had come out in advance, every single one had come out in advance and stated that they believed we're causing a global warming crisis. There was no objectivity in the selection process. This was an ends-driven process where people were selected, most of whom were not climate scientists, and those that were selected so that they can have the conclusion, they could present the conclusion that we're facing a crisis. Now, why would that be the case? Of course, everyone, scientists, non-scientists, we all have our own political beliefs. We all have our own agendas for society. This is going to creep into all of us. Now, it's especially the case when we're talking about bureaucracies such as that at the NAS. The NAS is funded almost entirely by the U.S. federal government. And in fact, they're funded almost entirely by agencies in the U.S. government who are promoting the notion that we're facing a global warming crisis. And the reason why these agencies promote it is because without this crisis, the justification for their ever-growing funding and their ever-growing power no longer exists. This is why we have NAS not asking their member scientists whether we're facing a crisis, not choosing scientists who are objective, but instead presenting from a very small number of people a statement asserting that we're facing a global warming crisis that is not backed up by the science. Now, I'd like to give moving from consensus, I'd like to give an example about what happens when we don't have a fair and honest debate. And coincidentally enough, in preparing my remarks, I focused on NASA and the Goddard Institute, so right after the tremendous talk we have. And I just have to observe that here I am in Germany. This is my first time here. It's my first time in Europe. And I've just felt overwhelming hospitality here. I'm so grateful. I'm walking in the airport. I'm trying to find my way to the trains. I'm trying to find my way around Munich. I don't speak German. Whenever I ask someone in English for help, they're so accommodating. I greatly appreciate it. And on top of that, here in Germany, you've given the world tremendous beer. You've given us cars that actually work and that go fast. You've given us Oktoberfest. And in return, in America, we've given you James Hansen and the NASA GIS. So I don't think that's quite a fair trade. Please don't hold it against me. But regarding the NASA Goddard Institute, known as GIS, it's real interesting because among NASA scientists, the scientists at NASA are split on this issue, just like they are in IPCC. But the media, they'll interview James Hansen, and then they'll say NASA scientists say this, NASA scientists say that, where there are many other NASA scientists who say the complete opposite. So the media is not presenting the truth when they say that NASA scientists believe we're facing a global warming crisis. Some of the NASA scientists, John Christie, Roy Spencer, who have worked with NASA for many years, who oversee the satellite data. There are others in the rank and file that I've come to know. John Theon, who used to be James Hansen's boss, who's attended some of our Heartland Institute conferences. They all say that we're not facing a global warming crisis. The media won't report that. Now, what's interesting is, in addition to there being a split within NASA, in 1979, when satellite instruments were launched, were put into orbit that could measure uniformly the Earth's temperature and could do it objectively, this was hailed as a scientific achievement, an advancement. This was going to pay tremendous dividends because we could finally have a better understanding of just how much our planet is warming. Now, the alarmists loved this development because they believed that the data would back them up, but on top of that, the satellite instruments are measuring temperatures in the Earth's lower atmosphere. And because this is where carbon dioxide is accumulating, this is where we're supposed to see more rapid warming than at the Earth's surface. So we would likely be seeing more warming in the satellite data than on the surface temperature measurements that are overseen by NASA GIS. So what has happened since we've had these satellite-based temperature measurements? We have a third of a century of temperature measurements, and we see substantially less warming than is reported by James Hansen and the NASA Goddard Institute. Now, some of this would come as a surprise to them and to others because, again, in the lower atmosphere, temperatures are supposed to warm faster than at the surface. But it also shows what is going on behind the scenes and that NASA scientists are indeed doctoring the data. We just saw proof of that. There are many more instances that had we had another 2 hours for the previous presentation, we would have seen that as well. But here's the thing that's really troubling, is that when we see evidence, irrefutable evidence, that the data is being doctored, and you present that, or even if we don't even go there, if I were just to mention that the satellite instruments contradict the surface-based temperature readings, and even if we don't get into the doctoring of the data, then I'm going to get accused of attacking climate scientists. I've been accused of attacking climate scientists anytime I question the data. You're accused of being anti-science when you look at data critically. The scientific method demands that we look at our own assumptions critically, that we do everything possible to disprove what we are asserting. And if we fail, then we invite others to do the same. If we try to strong-arm people into no longer participating in that process, if we try to shout them down, to humiliate them, to embarrass them, to call them names, call them anti-science, precisely for checking the science, this is not what science is about. This is anti-science. This is what is going to impede scientific advancement. This is what is going to stunt scientific learning. Everyone in this room deserves the praise, the never-ending praise of the media, of the global warming alarmists, because by being here, you are showing that you are challenging scientific assertions. And I certainly hope that we're not only challenging James Hansen and NASA GISS's scientific assertions, but what we see in here today. And that's why I greatly enjoyed the first question after the last presentation. You've taken a certain subset. It can be argued that you cherry-picked. So how do you respond? This is what we should be doing. And I thought the answer was right on target, that the data itself was not cherry-picked. And of course, even that small subset, when we're talking individual stations where they raise the temperature artificially a degree of Celsius or more over a century, you don't have to do that to too many stations to completely tarnish the century-long record on global temperatures and present a false warming trend that does not exist. One final example regarding where we see this distortion of the debate, and there's so many examples that we could cite, but I only have half an hour, and you're probably pretty happy for that. But one other example is Hurricane Sandy. For those of you that are from Europe or elsewhere, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but essentially we had a hurricane that struck the northeastern United States in early November. Now, this was unusual. We don't get many hurricanes in early November. And when this happened, the assertion was, this is more proof of global warming. How can you deny that we're facing a crisis when we see events that we haven't been seeing? You know, I can't recall the last time we had a New York City hurricane. That's what we were told. Shepard Smith on Fox News Channel, a conservative news organization that has generally given skeptics the ability to present their message. Shepard Smith said, folks, you can no longer dispute this. Things are changing. I mean, there's just no disputing it. Well, what's real interesting when we look at Hurricane Sandy, in the first case for people who are legitimately thinking that this is something unusual, yes, we haven't had many northeastern hurricanes of late, but the term of late, those two words are the most important words. Because in the first half of the 20th century, before we had significant global warming, human-caused or otherwise, hurricanes struck the Northeast rather regularly. It's only in the second half of the 20th century, as our planet warmed, that hurricanes stopped striking the Northeast. So now when we finally have a hurricane striking the Northeast, yes, it is an unusual event. Yes, this is something that didn't used to happen before. But that's only if we're talking about the last 40 years. When we compare it to a cooler climate, that's par for the course. So if we're really concerned about hurricanes striking the Northeast, I don't know. We still have to learn more about the science. But it would seem to indicate either global warming is having no effect on hurricanes striking the Northeast, or global warming is impeding hurricanes from striking the U.S. Northeast, and we don't have as many Hurricane Sandy events as we used to. Now, it's not just the U.S. Northeast. We know for a fact, I've written about this in my column. I have a weekly column at Forbes.com where I discuss hurricanes frequently because this is something the media and the global warming alarmists like to present. Anytime a hurricane strikes, it must be global warming, as if hurricanes never struck before global warming. But when you look at the data going back decade by decade, you see that hurricane strikes in the United States, especially if we're talking about the major hurricanes, Category 3 or higher, they're 50% more, there were 50% more hurricanes per decade in the first half of the 20th century than there were in the second half of the 20th century. Now, of course, hurricanes are going to strike. It's going to happen, just like we hear often about, this is a 100-year flooding event in Australia or a 100-year drought in Texas. Well, the Earth is a big place, and there are a lot of weather events that can occur. We should be expecting, we should be having 100-year events somewhere on the Earth on a fairly regular basis. And the same applies for hurricanes. Interestingly enough, in the United States, we just went through the longest period in U.S. history without a hurricane strike. When Hurricane Isaac struck Louisiana in August of this year, it broke, I believe it was like, actually I won't cite the specific number, I don't want to get it wrong, but it was several years, the longest period in U.S. history without a hurricane strike. By the way, last year it was asserted that a hurricane struck North Carolina. I forget the name of the hurricane, I think it was Irene. Actually, the surface weather station showed that when the hurricane struck, it wasn't a hurricane anymore. It was a hurricane at sea. When it struck, it was 69, 70 miles per hour. But even if we count that as a hurricane, again, we're going through a record-breaking time of few, if any, hurricane strikes in the United States. The first time a hurricane strikes, we see in the media and from the global warming alarmists that global warming must be to blame. The challenge here for people in this room, and of course, because you're in this room, I know that we are looking at the science objectively and critically, but for everyone else out there is whenever you see the assertion that some event is unusual, that's unprecedented, that it's proof of global warming, don't just take the word of the New York Times, and don't take the word of scientists just because they're scientists. Look at the data. There are scientists on all sides of the issue. There are scientists with their own personal agendas. There are scientists with their own scientific agendas. There are scientists with their own funding agendas. When we look at the data, we see that the media often does not present the truth as it exists. Now, bringing that back full circle, it's so wonderful to have this conference this year. It's so wonderful that Wolfgang and EIKE have brought this together. At the Heartland Institute, when we first had our international conference on climate change, and I told you about how difficult it was to pull in scientists from the other side, that conference was still a tremendous success. We thought we'd only do it once, and yet we've done it 8 times now. And the reason why it's been a success, even without the open and honest debate that we sought and still seek, I still invite dozens of scientists who believe we're facing a global warming crisis. I invite them to every conference. They don't show up. But the reason why it's such a success is that scientists from around the world, or maybe even from in the same state or the same country, oftentimes they had never even met each other before these conferences. They would read about each other's work. They may or may not call each other. They may or may not send emails. But the synergy that we have when we come together is just tremendous. The joy that I would see in scientists' eyes on their faces when they'd come together made it all worthwhile. The hard work that we put in, the hard work that Wolfgang's putting in, makes it all worthwhile. And my hope here is that by showing how cooperatively we can come together and discuss these issues, how we can challenge each other in this room, as we should, even if we generally agree, and we can do so in a manner that can be vigorous, that can be sharp, but at the same time is done professionally, cordially, with goodwill, then hopefully we can bring about what we've all been looking for, and I hope we've all been looking for, and that is an open, honest debate with all sides of the issue represented, where afterwards we can shake each other's hands, we can exchange Christmas cards, whatever it is, we don't have to get personal about it. And that's my hope from this conference. That's my hope from, hopefully, EIKE will sponsor this conference again next year, because that is what we accomplish together among each other, and that's what we can accomplish regardless of where we stand on this issue. So with that, I will take your questions, and thank you very much.